Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Denver Startup Week. I'm Kate Barton. I am on the Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee and a team member at the Downtown Denver Partnership. Thank you so much for joining us for our first ever virtual Denver Startup Week. If 2020 has taught us anything, it's that we're more powerful when we come together as a community to share ideas and help make each other better. And that's why we're here virtually, showing the Denver community and the world what we're made of. At Denver Startup Week, we strive to make all of our sessions a place where attendees can connect and grow and learn, regardless of gender identity, gender expression, race, ability, sexual orientation, and the combination of those identities. There's something for everyone at Denver Startup Week, and we're really grateful for you joining us. Today, we are excited to start our Stronger Together Women of Denver Startup Week series. It's last year, Denver Startup Week's Women Stronger Together series looked a little bit different, but this year we have some incredible women coming to showcase their expertise and help us all be stronger. We have 3 events happening this week, starting with today's keynote with Katica Roy. Really excited to hear from Katica. Tomorrow at 1 p.m. we have Nicole Galaros from Techstars, who's doing the perfect pitch. And then Thursday at 11 a.m., Nicole will be back again for her session called Founder Issues. So we hope you'll join us for these 3 events that make up our Stronger Together series. A big thank you to Promontory Mortgage Path for their support of the series and their support of women in entrepreneurship. Before we kick off, I would love to play a short video to introduce our DSW sponsors.
Hello, I'm Tammy Dorr, President and CEO of the Downtown Denver Partnership and co-founder of Denver Startup Week. This week is so important. It's important for us to come together and think big and boldly about our future, to dream and have visions for companies. These companies that are built today will be our economic strength, our economic drivers, and our economic saviors for the future of both our region, our state, and our country. We don't take it lightly. Come together during this week and make things happen. Before we dive in, we want to say a special thank you to our 2020 Denver Startup Week sponsors who make it all possible. Thanks to our title sponsors, Downtown Denver Partnership, JP Morgan Chase, Prologis, and Xero. And our track sponsors who have made all of the great content you're hearing today possible. Battery 621 and the Public Works, Capital One Cafe, Colorado Lending Source, Friday Help, Quizlet, Exactly, Zayo, and Zestful. Our headline event sponsors are bringing the excitement to all of you this week. Thank you to Wix, Kenzen, MAPR Agency, Obsidian HR, Kickstart Fund, Promontory Mortgage, Molson Coors, and Comcast. Finally, thank you to our partner and member sponsors. They're all listed on the screen. Thank you for your support of Denver Startup Week. Now, make things happen.
Great. Thank you so much to our sponsors who help make Startup Week free, and a special thank you to Promontory Mortgage Path. Now I'm going to turn it over to Laura Mays from Promontory Mortgage Path to say a few words and turn it over for this great session. Laura, welcome. Laura, you're still muted.
Thank you so much. Sorry.
There you go.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Laura Mays. I'm Manager of Data Insights at Promontory Mortgage Path. As sponsor of the Stronger Together Women in Denver Startup Week series, I'm excited to be able to welcome you to the session. For those of you that don't know us, Promontory Mortgage Path is a Denver-based fintech startup on a mission to fundamentally change the way community lenders approach their mortgage business. We've been lucky enough to continue to grow during these uncertain times. So if you're seeking an environment dedicated to your personal and professional growth and a place where you can have a lasting impact, I encourage you to stop by our virtual booth at the job fair. It's a great place to work. Check us out. We're grateful for the opportunity to partner with Denver Startup Week and to support Denver's diverse entrepreneurship ecosystem and do as much as we can to support women in entrepreneurship. I personally have gained so much inspiration from women who have and continue to forge the path like Katica Roy. The work she's doing to bring light to the link between gender equity and economic gain is critical. Thanks again. Enjoy the session. Here's Dave Mayer.
Thanks, Laura. Welcome, everybody. Happy Denver Startup Week, day number 2. Honored to be here as part of this important session. Thanks to all of you for being here. My name is Dave Mayer. I'm the CEO of Technical Integrity. We are a boutique executive search and engineering placement firm. I have a deep passion for building community, been involved with Denver Startup Week now for 7 years and 10 years with Boulder Startup Week, as well as doing a bunch of community building, startup ecosystem building on the Western Slope. Happy to be here today with Katica. Super grateful, very briefly, to all the Denver Startup Week organizers for helping us make this a reality and fighting all the technical glitches that are bound to happen. But grateful for everybody. Grateful also for you, Katica. Thank you and welcome, and appreciate you being here. I feel like a great place to start today is introducing yourself, how you got started in tech, and really how Pipeline came about, and then we can sort of dig in from there.
Sure. So my name is Katica Roy. I am the CEO and founder of Pipeline. For those who may not know, Pipeline is a software platform that increases the financial performance of companies through closing the gender equity gap. We actually started with research. We did a research study across 4,000 companies in 29 countries. And what we found was that for every 10% increase in gender equity, intersectional gender equity, so gender plus race and ethnicity and age, there's a 1% to 2% increase in revenue. So that's the model that we implemented in our platform. And essentially what we do is we're augmented decision-making. We intercept HR decisions, make recommendations, and enable companies to reach equity through the decisions that they're already making.
I'd love to go back even a little further. I know you started out as a technologist. Will you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So my first master's degree is actually in computer science and cognitive science, so how people's brains work, as well as programming. So I am a former full stack programmer, engineer, fluent in 4 programming languages. So that's my background, and had my favorite subject actually in school was math. If I could do algebra all day, I would have done it. And so I think probably just had a natural affinity for that. I think, for me, where Pipeline came from was a couple of things. One is, and I'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about COVID, but I am the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee, and that had a big impact on who my commitment to giving back, my commitment to the opportunities that I was given because I was born in this country. And I also fought to be paid equitably twice and won. And after the first time that I fought to be paid equitably, my commitment was that if you reported to me, I was going to ensure that you were both paid equitably, but also had equity of opportunity after having that experience. And that ultimately led me to launching Pipeline.
And was Pipeline the same when you applied to Techstars and went through Techstars as it is today?
Well, you evolve. I think when we first started Pipeline, we were focused on mid-market as our target market. And we realized quickly through the Techstars program that actually we needed to focus on enterprise companies, and we define those as companies that have 10,000 employees or more. And so, since that time, we pivoted during Techstars a couple of years ago, and then, really grew the company very quickly.
Awesome. So welcome to 2020, right? In a time of racial reckoning, you're a gender economist running a SaaS company focused on equity in the workforce. Maybe we can start with a few definitions. What exactly is a gender economist, and what is your definition of intersectionality, and how does that all come together here in 2020?
Sure. So gender economist is someone who looks at the economy through the lens of gender. So for instance, we have key economic indicators like the monthly jobs report or the quarterly GDP report. So someone who is a gender economist actually looks at that through the lens of gender. So actually disaggregating or essentially separating the data to look at what does that look like for men, women of color, et cetera. Our definition of intersectionality, and we didn't come up with this definition, but it is essentially marrying together two or more diverse factors. So Pipeline has always been gender first, but we are not gender only. So we look at it through the lens of gender plus race and ethnicity and age. What Pipeline does is actually anchor off of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So what companies are actually tracking. There's a couple of reasons why we look at it through the gender first lens. One is that women are 51% of the population and 47% of the labor base. So as long as you look at gender through an intersectional lens, it's actually, because women are the largest diverse cohort, you can actually move everyone forward. That's one. The other piece of that is that when you intersect two or more diverse factors, so for instance, gender plus race and ethnicity, so Black women or Latinas, or gender and age, so for instance, women over the age of 45, what you tend to find is that they are actually farther behind either younger women or white women. And so that intersectionality matters. I'll give you just a quick example. One of the things that Pipeline has found through its implementations is that on average, men are promoted in that very first promotion from individual contributor to frontline manager. They are actually promoted at a rate of 21% greater than women. But when you intersect race with gender, so Black women specifically, that gap doubles. So men are promoted at a rate of 42% greater than Black women.
Let's talk a little bit when we were going over this in our prep, you're talking about how remote work is actually pushing women out of the workforce. You talk about that and how we can fix that, and specifically how you're working towards that with AI.
Yeah, and it can push women out of the workforce. I think that the what we have found during COVID is that women's jobs are 1.8 times more vulnerable than men's. The unemployment rate for women is higher. And one of the things that we risk in the move to remote work is actually women become invisible. So they are less able to move forward. And we kind of see that in a few different ways. One is how performance is actually measured. So one of the things that we know from research is that managers tend to rate people higher the more they see them. And so in remote work, women become less visible. So that's one piece of it. They also become less valued. So there's a pay gap, as well as less opportunity for upward mobility. And so one of the things that we saw pre-COVID actually was that women were increasing their labor force participation and actually held the majority of all jobs in the US prior to COVID-19. We're now seeing that reversing trend, and AI can actually then intercept those decisions that are being made. So typically performance, promotion, and pay, and actually ensure that they're equitable and that women aren't actually stepping back. I think there has been sort of historically this talk about keeping women in the workforce, but particularly moms in the workforce, about flexibility. Really what we need to offer is opportunity, because if you offer women equity of opportunity, they can handle their flexibility. And so and AI is really a key tool to use that. And we've actually seen that as well in the acceleration of the use of AI in HR decision-making this year.
So let's dig on a little bit on that. Will you talk a little bit about your technology, why you decided on AI, and how it's really creating leverage and opportunity?
Sure. So Pipeline is essentially a recommendations engine. So what we do is API into the back end of companies' HR tech stack. Typically, they've got at least 2 HR systems, a core HR system like a Workday or SuccessFactors, as well as an applicant tracking system like a Taleo or a Greenhouse. When they go to make a decision across the 5 pillars of talent, which are really the 5 largest buckets of decision-making: hiring, pay, we do internal hiring, pay, performance, potential, and promotion, we actually intercept those decisions, run them through our algorithms, and if there's any inequity, we make a recommendation. So to give you an example of what that looks like, if a company posts a job requisition, we actually will look for internal candidates that can fill that position. So we, on average, find for 86% of all job requisitions that our customers post, we find 5 or more qualified internal candidates. The other thing that we have found, which ties to this, to remote work and AI ensuring equity in remote work, is that you can't close the gender pay gap by starting with pay. So last year, Colorado, actually, I know we'll talk about Colorado more specifically in a bit, but Colorado actually passed one of the most comprehensive equal pay laws. And one of the things that we found through our implementations is that pay is the symptom, it's not the disease. So in other words, pay is the quantitative value you place on your talent, but the actual value you place on your talent happens in performance and potential. So we have to get those decisions right. What we find is that on average, about a third of all performance reviews in companies actually have bias in them. And that leads to lower performance ratings for women. And then that also leads to lower potential ratings for women, which is essentially getting into the future leadership succession pipeline. And those become inputs to pay. And so if we want to close the gender pay gap, then we need to look upstream to performance and potential. I think the other thing too that we have found is that there's a lot of talk in equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion around what strategies do we put into place to ensure that we're equitable. Well, one of the things that we know is that the system is by default inequitable. Like we don't value people equitably. We know that. So one of the things that Pipeline does through its platform is actually by default make the system equitable. And that's really a change to how things are currently done.
So we'll talk more about the Colorado here in a moment, but I want to let everybody know, we'll talk for another 15 or 20 minutes, specifically Katica and I, but I encourage everybody to put your questions in the chat, and we'll open it up for Q&A here in a bit. So let's talk about Colorado. How are we doing generally? As it pertains to the rest of the country. Obviously, you just talked about the equal pay law, and what can we do in the business community to be better?
So I'll just start off with the political piece of it, because political and the business tie together. So Colorado has never had a female governor, a female United States senator, and no woman of color has ever represented Colorado at the federal level. Just to give you a sense of comparison, the first state in the union to have a female governor was Wyoming, our neighbor to the north. The second was Texas. Both of those firsts actually happened 95 years ago. So we're kind of far behind. We're actually only one of 5 states in the union who have never had a female governor nor a female United States senator. So we have work to do. Also, none of the Fortune 500 companies that are actually headquartered here in Colorado are actually led by women. So we have work to do in terms of ensuring equity of opportunity and equity of pay in the state of Colorado. One of the interesting things that we talk about is that women, there's often this, I think, misunderstanding that equal pay or equity of opportunity for women is really a women's issue. It's a women's right issue, and it's actually not. It's an economic opportunity. We know, for instance, in the state of Colorado, we could increase our state GDP by $40 billion if we close the gender equity gap. $9 billion of that is pay, so it's actually an economic opportunity. But also couple that with the fact that in the state of Colorado, 45% of households with children under the age of 18, women are the breadwinners. And so when we leave women behind, it's not only about women, it's also about our future labor force. So we need to think about how we're actually investing in our talent to ensure equity and fundamentally economic growth.
Anything else, Colorado specifically, that we can take as lessons? Obviously, those are good overarching rules. Anything you would point to that Colorado is getting right, and or places that we need to put some additional emphasis?
The Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, which goes into effect on January 1st, 2021, I think is a very important step in the right direction. It's the most comprehensive one of the most comprehensive equal pay laws in the U.S. So it focuses not only on equal pay, but equity of opportunity. I think that Colorado as a state, it also needs to think about how, two things. One is how we continue to move female leaders forward into senior roles, so that we have more women represented in senior roles. I would also, I think that there has been a fair amount of focus on ensuring equity for women in the startup scene, but I think there's still more to do. I don't, just my experience as a female founder, there's more work that we can do in that regard to really focus on ensuring equity, and that would be good for our state's economy. We've got different pockets of it. And then I think last would be how we think about the talent pipeline within elected office and the political realm, that we really need to think about and have a focused effort to ensure that at some point in the next 10 years or so, we actually have a female governor or a female United States senator, or that we're really closing that gap.
Thank you for that. Let's talk about ethical artificial intelligence a little bit. As we've discussed, there's a flood of AI platforms, some with good intentions, but likely rife with bias, right? Mm-hmm. And so how do we fix that? How do we account for that? And how is Pipeline specifically accounting for it?
So we have, a couple of years ago, I actually sat on a panel for The Atlantic for the future of work. And the question then was, who wins in the age of AI? And the truth is, we don't know, because it's up to us. The beauty of the moment that we are in right now is that we are in the fourth industrial revolution, right? Where we are adopting new technologies and implementing them at a speed at which we never have before. And it's both a great risk, but it's also a great opportunity. And the reason is that you can actually root out bias at scale, right? Before, we couldn't do that. If you think about, like, most of the companies we work with, 10,000 employees or more, they are typically global companies. You're talking about tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of decisions that are made about talent each year. How do you really do that at scale? How do you ensure equity at scale? That's why many companies have done pay equity audits or equity audits, right? Rather than actually getting ahead of it. To give you a sense of what that looks like, in what is predicted right now in the next 2 years, if we don't really focus on closing the gender equity gap in AI, which I'll talk about in a second, is that 85% of AI projects will actually have bias baked into them, which means that we will hard code who is valued in the US. Just to give you two pretty high profile examples of the impact of that. One was Amazon's hiring app, which was biased against women. It biased toward men because there wasn't a thought around what might be biased in the data and how do we actually solve for that. The second piece of that, second example, was the launch of the Apple Card, which gave women with the same assets as their husbands actually less credit. So it was, and that's an example we see, for instance, like women starting businesses, they have less access to the credit markets. So we have this opportunity. Currently, there's a global 28-point gap in AI, gender gap in AI practitioners. So we should really be focusing very specifically on how we close that gender gap, particularly from an intersectional lens, because the people who are behind the scenes actually programming the AI are the ones who can understand from their lived experience what bias might actually be created. I talked about, for instance, pipeline on average finds bias in a third of all performance reviews. Well, if you just put that through, as a training data set and don't understand what you're actually finding, now what you're saying is, well, women are just less, they're less qualified, they're not as valuable. And so now we've just baked that in. The flip side of that is that if we make a focused effort to actually root out bias in our algorithms, it's a tremendous economic opportunity, and we can root out bias at scale, which is a huge opportunity.
So what are the guidelines and frameworks we should be aware of? What should we be asking for? Obviously, Elon talks a lot about it. What are your recommendations for ethical development of AI?
So I think it's interesting. Senator Cory Booker actually last year introduced a bill for algorithmic accountability. And a couple of things that we should do is make it auditable and explainable. So what actually is the AI doing? How does it work? There is a way to do that without compromising your IP. I obviously am aware of that. Looking at AI audits. So can you have, we have different AI nonprofits who are looking at bias in AI. Can we create an AI audit that actually runs different data sets through the algorithms to see, what bias might be present? Those are, and then I would say, lastly, from a policy perspective, which is also why it matters that we get equitable representation, both in the state of Colorado, but more broadly in the United States, is that we, at the federal level, actually have a technology assessment organization that can actually understand what the future technology is that's coming and help educate Congress about how do we create policy to ensure that we don't leave people out.
I think I'm going to jump into a few of the chat questions, maybe a little bit back and forth, but let's see. Laura B says, what would you say to executives who still think that those in tech are white and male? Do you have any suggestions for sourcing more diversity in candidates? And if a workforce is mostly white and male currently, what steps can an organization do to accommodating women and persons of color rather than assimilation?
Well, the first is that that's not what the data says. The data says that that it's not a pipeline problem. That is, there is plenty of diversity in tech. We're just not looking for it. There is an issue with the like me. That is, I just hire people like me, or I just find people like me. That's one. Sourcing, there are certainly solutions for sourcing more diversity in candidates. It's important. It is not the only issue, and I'll tell you why. One of the things that the research shows is that the best way to attract diverse talent is to ensure that your existing diverse talent is successful, and not just in their current role, but across your company. And so one of the things that we see is that companies source diverse talent but they don't actually create a system or a structure that values that talent equitably. Sometimes it's called tokenism. And so what happens is that there's a higher attrition rate for diverse talent. So sourcing is one piece of it, but then you need to ensure that there's actually equity across the entire employee life cycle, because if there's not, you're not going to keep those people. That's one. So for the steps that organizations do to make them more accommodating to women and people of color rather than assimilation. So there is actually that balance between belonging and standing out. There is that, but what we would recommend to start is at least to start with a scorecard or a dashboard, some type of way to measure how well you're really doing beyond representation, just beyond pure numbers in terms of equity. And then obviously Pipeline does this, but use technology and other means to ensure that you're actually valuing people equitably. I think one of the things that is a misunderstanding is that companies feel like they need to be perfect, right? And the truth is that they don't. What they need to be is accountable and transparent. Diverse talent, women, people of color, we experience the bias that comes up. We know that it's not perfect. That's not the issue. The issue is that we want to ensure that it's both accountable and transparent, that we don't have to be the ones that are always carrying the burden of speaking up, that in fact the responsibility for ensuring equity doesn't sit with the people who experience inequity, it sits with the people who actually lead the company. That's where it sits. And so so the steps that can be taken are a dashboard and then actually ensuring that your system itself is equitable.
So you talked a little bit about belonging without calling it as much. I think in conjunction with the last question here, from a candidate perspective, how do you fight against the optics of being a diversity hire or hired due to gender or race? I think, let's answer that, but also, what are the solutions for the organization to create more belonging, to create more sort of ownership and a welcoming environment?
So the responsibility for fighting against the optics of like the tokenism, that's what that's called, should not sit with the person who is diverse. That actually, by the way, more broadly is the issue with our equity laws in the United States. That is, the Equal Pay Act was signed into law in 1963 by President Kennedy. It still relies on women to speak up about unequal pay rather than the responsibility being with companies. That's one. The second is that if you look at it from an economic perspective, in the US, we could actually add $2 trillion to our GDP if we close the gender equity gap. And actually, since 1970 and women increasing their labor force participation, we've actually added $2 trillion to the US GDP through women increasing the labor force participation. So rather than gender equity as the right thing to do, it's actually an economic opportunity. As I mentioned in the introduction, we found through our research across 4,000 companies in 29 countries that for every 10% increase in gender equity, there's a 1% to 2% increase in revenue. And so gender equity is not only a social issue, it's actually a massive economic opportunity. And the more that the economic footprint of your company expands, the more that there's opportunity for everyone. So moving away from the right thing to do to actually an economic opportunity, it shifts the conversation. I think and it really shifts the conversation from women and people of color being the charity case, or in other words, the sort of damsels in distress, and men being the problem, to fundamentally, this is about opportunity for everyone.
I think you'll appreciate this next question, Katica, around creating more flexibility for men to play a larger role as, pick up the kids from school, stay home when the kid is sick. The comment is, I feel like the culture overall needs to change and truly share the responsibility. Where do you weigh in on this, and how does that play into the economics?
It does. So it's interesting. So I am a breadwinner mom. I have been for the last 12 years. My husband is a stay-at-home dad. And 48% of working dads would actually like to join my husband as a stay-at-home parent. In the state of Colorado, we have about 27,000 stay-at-home dads out of a population of roughly 5 million. So there's a lot of work to do. The reason that men typically don't stay home or they don't take paternity leave is there's two. It's actually identity and isolation. That is, who am I? Our collective definition of what it means to be a man in our society, and who will I connect to? And my husband experienced this firsthand, really that sense of isolation, because when he started staying home, he was not only often the only dad in the room, like at Gymboree or music class, but he was also often the only man in the room, that sort of sense of not belonging. So we need couple that with the fact that during COVID, women's unpaid work has gone up 153%, and we have some more work to do. We need to look at things like, move away from things like caregiver leave and move away from things like maternity leave and paternity leave and actually look at it as caregiver leave. That's far more inclusive because it's not gendered in terms of who gets leave. It also takes into account the sandwich generation. I became part of the sandwich generation this year, which are people who are both raising their children, but also caring for their elderly parents. So it's more inclusive in that regard. And then we really need to think about how we create more connection for men in the workplace who want a different role, right? They want to stay home with their kids. And actually what the data shows is that it's good for kids. That kids are actually more self-sufficient when they're raised by stay-at-home dads.
Super interesting. Please continue to add questions into the chat here. There's one, Renee, I'm not 100% sure what you're asking, but we're going to try to get to it. With regards to algorithm scoring, she asks, are people just adjusting their technological use to fit into a more positive algorithm standing? And is that possible?
I think that's use case specific. You know, because I think what she's talking about is how you train algorithms through what your behavior is online. Mm-hmm. So that would be, for instance, like what you search for on Google, or right. And the connection between what you see pop up in Amazon. And I mean, I think that's what she's, but I think that's very use case specific.
There we go. So she said, adjusting your personal behavior so that you get a different response. Yes. Anything you want to add there, Katica?
You know what I think is interesting, just as a female founder, is that if you search for me on the internet, and I have a tracker that a few of them that tracks my name, but just randomly I'll go search for myself just to see what I find. It's so interesting because one of the top suggestions after you type in my name is Katica Roy husband. Essentially the idea that I must be attached to somebody, like my husband must be someone who's prominent and wealthy in order for me to be who I am. It's so fascinating. And I'm not the only one this happens to, but it's this idea that women, sort of idea that like we have a value because we're related to men, not because we have value because we're humans. It's so fascinating, but anyway.
Well, unfortunately for me, there's way too many Dave Mayers in the world, so I can't do that tracking. How about maybe a shift? I see another question popped up, but I think this is sort of in line. Sort of rewind a little bit to Katica 20 years ago. If there's a young Katica to follow in your footsteps, what would the advice be to a young woman or young entrepreneur, really of any stripe, to come up in 2020, and how do you sort of break down some of these barriers, and how do you sort of find yourself in this day and age?
So I If I was to talk to my 26-year-old self, there's a couple of things. I have two frames of reference for this. One is my own career, but the also is because I have a daughter. So the first is that your voice matters. Don't dull your voice. Don't be quiet because people won't like what you have to say. And it's important for me now, but it was also important when I was 26 and navigating sort of entering the workplace, that we often, there's a lot of talk about fixing women. A lot of the solutions in the workplace right now for gender diversity have been focused on fixing women, whether it's teaching them to apply for jobs, which actually is only half the data, teaching them to negotiate, teaching them to speak differently. And the truth is that women aren't broken, the system is broken, and we need to fix the system. So this idea that women have imposter syndrome or that we're less confident, it's because we've grown up in a system. That doesn't mean we don't have personal responsibility, but we have grown up in a system that has told us not to be those things, right? That we have value for other things. I'm also a mom of both a boy and a girl. My son is 13, my daughter is 9. One of the things actually you see, and it's there intentionally, which is that right there, is a card that my daughter wrote me for Mother's Day when she was in kindergarten. And in it says, "Thank you for teaching me how to be the smartest girl in the room." And one of the things that I taught my daughter that I noticed was different between my son and my daughter is that when my daughter was little, people would compliment her on how she looked. And that never happened to my son. They would say, "Oh, she's so cute." So I taught my daughter to say, "And I'm smart too." And the reason why, it wasn't just an education for the people who were saying that to her, but it was actually an education for my daughter, that her value was not in how she looked, but that she was also smart too. So that anytime someone would compliment her on how she looked, the tape that would play in her head would be, "And I'm smart too." And I think that's the influence that we can have, that look up to the people who are in front of you and what might be possible for you, and don't give up. Just don't give up. I talked a little bit about being the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. And for me, when my father made the decision to escape from Hungary after the fall of the 1956 revolution, he was not only risking his life, he was also risking the lives of his 3 daughters, my 3 older sisters, who were 3, 7, and 8 at the time. And they crossed a minefield, they crossed the border into Austria. And I'll finish the story, but I'll tell you why that's particularly important to me. They lived in a refugee camp in Austria for just under 2 months when President Eisenhower sent Air Force One to bring 21 Hungarian refugees to the US on Christmas Day, 1956, and they were on that plane. And so when I think about the things that I might face or the things that might be difficult, this year would be certainly an example of that. I step back and I think about the decision that my dad made to risk not only his life, but his daughter's lives for freedom. And then whatever I'm facing just doesn't seem as hard. Like, it puts a frame of reference on what might be possible if you actually do push through. And what I think about is this. My father went from choosing to risk his daughter's lives for freedom to watching them climb the stairs of Air Force One to freedom. That is what is possible if you do not give up.
I feel like we should just end there. We'll take 1 or 2 more. There's a question about raising funds for a startup, and a perception in the broken system that you need to have a male advisor, a male co-founder, or some bullshit like that. So how do we fix that? How do we, Karen, forgive me, I don't know if it's Karen or Karen, asked, how do you get taken seriously by a VC or by an angel, or, by as a a young woman who is pitching, and Fawn rightfully connected or corrected. And how about for maybe somebody who's just a career changer, not necessarily, first part of the career?
Yeah, so that's funny. I actually talk about how I jumped from the frying pan into the fire when I went from being in the corporate world to launching Pipeline. And the reason is that I went from so in the corporate world, 68% of leaders in the corporate world are men. In venture, 92% are men. So I went went to pitching more men. What the data shows is this, and I've written articles about it. I've written both blogs as well as for Entrepreneur. Is actually that female founders and for NBC, so you can find those articles. I can happy to send them with Denver, share them with Denver Startup Week to share out. But what the data shows is that female founders outperform male founders. That in actual fact, our return on capital, our return on invested capital, our what we produce for what's actually invested in our startups, we outperform male founders. So if there is and I have given this feedback, by the way, to VCs, if there is that sort of talking down to you or whatever, that in actual fact, VCs are responsible to their LPs. They have people who invest in their funds that they are responsible for making a return for. And if they don't make that return, they're not going to be a VC for very long. One, that is their responsibility. So arm yourself with the data. The second piece of it is that there's actually really good research that came out of Columbia around prevention versus promotion questions. So female founders are more likely to get prevention questions from investors. That is, how are you going to prevent the downside? Perfect example for 2020. How are you going to ensure that you grow during an economic downturn? Male founders are actually asked promotion questions like, how big could this company get? What is your big vision? So there's actually very specific tactics and strategies for turning a prevention question into a promotion question. You can go out and look at the research. Donna Kanze, Kanze, actually is the spearheaded that research. You can find it in Harvard Business Review. I would definitely educate yourself on that. And what she actually found is that the ability and skill of an entrepreneur to turn a prevention question into a promotion question actually ties to the amount of money that they raise.
Anybody have a final burning question? And if not, I may turn it over to you, Katica, to give maybe some final thoughts. Anything you want to share to help people inspire folks on day 2 of Denver Startup Week here. Looks like we got some just a sort of reaffirmation around what you just said, but any final thoughts from you, Katica?
Yeah, there was a question. There was a couple of questions in the Q&A that I thought I might address. One was talking about how you need to invest in our talent and the need to move more female leaders to senior roles. What investment needs to be made? What resources do these women need to advance? So there has been an incorrect narrative in the workplace that women don't know how to be in the workplace. That's like the women's leadership programs, teaching them to negotiate, teaching them to apply for jobs. What we have found is that actually what you need to do is value women equitably. It's not that women don't know how to be in the workplace. It's that the workplace wasn't designed to value them equitably. So if we change that system, then we can actually move more women into senior roles. And just to give you an example of what that looks like, women are actually the majority of all college graduates, and they have been for quite some years now. So if you're actually looking to hire the most the most educated folks, you actually should be looking for women, and not just at the entry level, but how do you actually move them up your, to ensure equity of opportunity and moving folks up, in terms of equity of opportunity. And that really is not only an issue of fairness, but really an issue of economic opportunity for everyone. And I think the other thing, one of the things, I had an interesting conversation with someone yesterday about the motherhood penalty. That is this idea that even if you're perceived to be of childbearing age as a woman, you don't even have to be pregnant or have kids, that you are going to be less committed to your work. This is a huge issue, and for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not true. What the data shows is that working moms are actually the most productive employees in the workforce over the course of their career. So if you wanted to invest in any cohort, moms are an important one. The other thing that we have found is Pipeline spearheaded research a couple of years ago about breadwinner moms, and I published some of the results in Fast Company. But one of the things, and we looked at it through an intersectional lens, breadwinner moms, so those moms that support 50% or more of the economic well-being of a family, actually have the largest gender pay gap as a cohort of any cohort in the US. That is, they earn 66 cents on the dollar. And there are 16 million breadwinner moms in the US, and they support 28 million children, essentially 40% of our future labor force. When you intersect that with race and ethnicity, Black breadwinner moms actually have the largest pay gap of any women in the workforce. It's 44 cents on the dollar, 44 cents on the dollar. And they actually support the majority of all Black children in the US, and they have for the last 38 years. So when we look at the data, we really need to think about what our own patterns that we've essentially created about who is valuable and who is not, and look at the data and use that data to change our behavior. One of the things we talk about, and I talked a little bit about this, but essentially creating an by default equitable system using Pipeline, is that a few years ago, there was talk about 401k savings rates, and that 401k savings rates weren't high enough. So what companies did was actually auto-enroll new employees in 401k savings plans. And what they found was that the savings rate went up. Why is that? Because we've actually changed the system. That is, it's harder for me to unenroll in a 401k savings plan. We did the very same thing with Pipeline. If we're now making a recommendation to you about how you can choose to pay someone equitably or ensure that you value them equitably, either through performance or potential, if I reject that recommendation, I'm now choosing not to be equitable. That, when we talk about the Great Reset, what's possible during COVID-19, how we bounce back faster from the economic fallout to COVID-19, how we close the racial gaps that we have in the United States, that is what is possible at this moment. And one of the things that we found through 2008, through the Great Recession, is that companies that put equity at the core of their crisis management strategy actually increase the velocity of their recovery. There is no more important time that we should be ensuring equity in every decision that we're making.
I knew you would bring it home beautifully. Thank you to Katica. Thank you to everybody at Denver Startup Week. Thank you for being here. You can visit Katica and Pipeline at pipelineequity.com, and you can see our work around inclusive and equitable teams at technicalintegrity.com. And we're grateful for you, and we're going to give you a few moments of your day back, and have a wonderful day. Enjoy Denver Startup Week.
Thank you.
Looks like you got some good stuff coming in the chat here. I'm presuming that Denver Startup Week is still here somewhere and we're still recording, but that's what the edit button is for, I guess.